Fire safety training. I decided to sort of throw this one into the mix when we were told had some things to talk about at the conference, because this is something I'm quite passionate about, training. I've been involved in it quite heavily in the past. So at the moment, I'm the Science and Technology Facilities Council Fire Safety Manager. So I run essentially a fire safety training program across 4-5 sites with around about 4,000 people in mainly a sort of a science and technology laboratories, that kind of environment. Previous to that, I was in insurance for a couple of years, and previous to that, I was in the Air Force, where I finished my last 4 years in the Air Force, was the head of fire safety, which covered an organisation of about 70,000 people, and fire training for them was obviously quite challenging to get that many people trained, refreshed, and all the rest of it. But I really, in that job, I really saw the benefits of an effective fire safety training program, rather than just some of the tick box stuff I've seen in other jobs when I've been going around to places, doing fire risk assessments. What do you do for your fire training? And they're often quite surprised when they say, oh yeah, we do fire training, it's all online. And then I say, okay, can you show me? What do you cover? What do you do for induction training? What do you do for your fire marshals? What do you do? And they get quite panicked. You can see it in their face, because I think a lot of fire risk assessors and risk assessments don't necessarily get into the details sometimes. Now, sometimes you don't need to, because it's a very sort of low, benign environment. Other times, when it's a bit more of a high-risk environment, that's when you really need to get into it from a fire risk assessment perspective. So, quite passionate about this. So I'm going to cover off the benefits of an effective fire safety training program, what the legal requirements are, some guidance and best practice, although there's not a huge amount out there, to be honest. And then looking at frequency and complexity of training, and then just going through a couple of the main types of fire safety training. Can't go into it in the depth that I probably would if I had a free rein and a couple of hours to talk about, but hopefully I can cover off some of the main pertinent points to kind of keep you on track and think about things to look for. So, benefits of an effective fire safety training program. That should always be the first one, because going back to the basic principles of fire safety, if we don't have the fire in the first place, we don't need the alarms, we don't need the compartmentation, the fire doors and all the rest of it. Far too many times do I see fire training getting straight into what to do in the event of a fire. Let's stop the fire happening in the first place. That should always be the key focus for me. And staff are key to helping you maintain a good level of fire safety in the premises. So getting them to help you implement the protective and preventative measures, telling them what they can do, telling them what they can't do, how they're going to avoid a fire in the first place, they're all kind of key considerations. Legal compliance, clearly there is an article in the Fire Safety Order, Article 21, that talks about fire safety training. As with most policy, most legislation, it's quite high level and it doesn't really get into the detail, which we'll get into a little bit more today, hopefully. And we'll talk about Article 21 in a moment. It helps you minimize damage should a fire occur. How many people, just a quick show of hands, have had a significant or a serious fire in their workplace? Pleasant aftermath? No. For those who can't see, they're all shaking their heads. It's a nightmare. There's lots and lots of considerations. It's not just financial. There's disruption. There's customers that are affected, residents. There's reputational risk, because you're going to be on social media now as soon as the fire happens, before the fire service have even probably got there. And people are now starting to form an opinion of your organisation because you've had a fire. Even if it's just someone can see smoke from 30 miles away, they'll take a picture. So there's all these ramifications, and obviously potentially legal ramifications if it's found that you haven't met your Article 21 requirements. And I think that slide, that little bit there, is just around if you've got an effective fire safety training program. If you look at the statistics there, 24% of buildings, other buildings that had fires, had no fire damage. 30%, the damage was limited to the equipment where the fire started. 20% it was limited to the room of origin, and only 26% it then turned into a bigger fire. And obviously that's down to probably better training, better awareness, but obviously that's an indicator of where you can be. You want to obviously get that 26% of fires that were larger down even more, and I think having an effective fire safety training program does help you do that. And it provides staff with confidence as well. Too many times people have trained to do something or asked to do something. So we want you to be a fire marshal. We want you to help us maintain and do checks for us. But the training's pretty poor. Apologies. What we need to do is try and train people to do what we're asking them to do. And for me, that's why if you get the 4 training sort of elements that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail right, you should hopefully be there in that space. So, Article 21. I'm not going to go through all that. However, I'm just going to pick out the big ticket items out of that. So, the responsible person must ensure that employees are provided with adequate safety training. What does adequate look like? Very much depends, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on when we look at sort of the complexity and risk-based training. They should be trained at specific times. So, at the time when they're first employed. So induction training, that's not just induction into the organisation, that's local induction into the building as well. And that's something that your generic fire awareness training can't capture. So you need to have measures in place to capture that requirement to make sure people are inducted into a building and they know exactly what's going on in there. And we'll cover these in a bit more detail later. If they're exposed to a new or increased risk, if they're transferred, if their responsibilities are transferred or there's change of responsibilities, so i.e. if your fire marshals were doing it one way and we change the procedure to make them do it another way, we need to then retrain everybody to make sure that they're trained adequately. The introduction of new work equipment or introduction of new technology. So if you've got a new building, you'll probably find that the fire safety measures in that building are a lot more advanced than what they are in the old buildings. Cause and effect. What happens when the fire alarms go off? Do the ventilation shut down? Do fire doors close on their own? So you've got to make sure you capture all of these when you get a new building on site. It's brilliant because you're obviously in a lot better place for that particular building. But what I found on my old and aged estate is we've got a lot of legacy buildings that aren't necessarily at the top of their game in terms of how they perform in a fire. And most organisations are the same. So it's just making sure that we train people when we do have new technology being used. And then it goes on to say, sorry, I've skipped ahead too quickly there, that training should be repeated periodically. How helpful is that? How often is periodically? It should be repeated when things have changed in the organisation. Or if a fire risk assessment identifies through the fire risk assessment that there's a need to refresh the training. And it should take place during working hours. I've heard a number of people say that they're not given time during working hours and they're expected to do it at home. That's not the case at all, and it shouldn't be. So what have we got to support the regulatory reform fire safety order? We've got a series of documents, guidance documents that have been produced by the government. There's websites, there's the old DCLG guides that we all know that need a bit of an update and a refresh, but there is advice in there, not loads, not very prescriptive, but there's things in there that tells us about fire safety training and things that we should be considering when we're looking at it. If it's guidance that has been provided by the Secretary of State and Government under Article 50 of the Fire Safety Order, you have to adhere to it or demonstrate how you're going to comply with it alternatively. And we'll talk a little bit more around that later, because one of the most provocative things about some of the guidance is you have to do it annually. And people get very upset about that when you tell them they've got to do fire safety training annually. But training comes in many forms. Do you need to put them through a formal training course annually, or can you do a toolbox talk and do a formal training course every 3 years kind of thing? So there's a lot more ways to skin the cat while still maintaining your compliance with the guidance under Article 50. So frequency and complexity of training. Most of the government guidance suggests that training should be conducted at least annually. My personal view, and certainly from a lot of my colleagues who do fire risk assessments, a risk-based approach is generally advocated. So you look at the risk profile of your organisation, look at what your people are doing in the environments that they're working in, and then you're looking at, is it a high-risk environment? Is it low risk? So if it's a low-risk office kind of environment, plenty of escape routes and all that kind of stuff, are you looking at maybe a 3-year frequency for your fire training, and then you fill in the middle years with a little bit of a toolbox talk and things like that? Some of my staff work in laboratories where they're working with high-risk processes. They need to do training a lot more often. And also, they should probably be doing a lot more practical hands-on training with the extinguishers because they're most likely to see a fire than maybe somebody in a lower risk environment. So for me, looking at the little diagram there, the higher risk, the higher level of training expected, the lower the risk, you can obviously tailor it and tailor it down. So different types of fire training. I've kind of picked out the 4 or 5 kind of areas that I think most organisations need to focus on. So fire induction training. So what you're looking for there is, so for me, if you've got one building, then it's not too bad. You can kind of tailor your fire awareness training into your building induction training. But where I've got, I think, 90 odd buildings, everything's different. They've all got nuanced ways of getting in and out the building and different risks. So having building-specific fire safety information. So this is normally delivered by the line managers in the building or the building fire managers in my case. And they go through all new starters, telling them what to do in the event of a fire, a tour of the premises, which covers the locations of the fire assembly point, fire escape routes, and firefighting equipment and what type of equipment you've got, and any other relevant information. So we've got areas that have got fire suppression systems, and obviously we've got to be careful when we're putting people into areas with fire suppression systems. So we've got a process where we talk them through what they can and can't do with regards to the fire suppression system and whatnot. So anything that's specific to the building, identified in the fire risk assessment maybe, that should be covered in local induction training. You've then got types of fire awareness training. For me, giving them a really brief overview of the legal requirements, including what the fire risk assessment does. Doesn't have to be too in-depth, but just to give them that flavour that this is actually a legal requirement and we have got obligations. And the obligations aren't only on the responsible person, they're on them as well. There isn't obviously the article in the Fire Safety Order and the Health and Safety at Work Act that says they have to do what they're asked to do, essentially. Fire prevention principles. Stop the fire in the first place. So going through the do's and don'ts, what you can do, how you manage cooking, how you manage smoking, how you manage flammable materials, storage and all that kind of stuff, housekeeping. All of that stuff is critically important, but generally in a lot of training sessions I've seen, it tends to be a slide or 2 for fire prevention and everything else is on what's happened when the fire's actually happened. Let's flip it. Let's stop the fire happening. Awareness of fire safety systems and principles of compartmentation. Some people have balked at that a little bit when I've talked about this previously, but how do you expect them to help you maintain and manage them systems? So if the fire alarm's bleeping in the morning or it's got an amber light on it, just giving them that basic understanding of how they can help us fix things and report things. And I saw this as a massive, massive difference in the Air Force over 4 years, where we went from only building sort of fire managers and health and safety focused people reporting things to a lot more reporting was taking place. And then we could fix things quicker, so we weren't waiting for formal inspections to get things resolved and whatnot. So it does make quite a big difference. Principles of compartmentation. Anybody in here doesn't have compartmentation issues with people kicking holes in walls, drilling things? You know, it's a big problem. So let's train people and teach people why they're not allowed to do that, what the compartmentation does for them. It protects your escape routes. It helps you get out the building if there's a fire. Actions on discovering a fire alarm, obviously, is one of the main ones. So what do we expect them to do? And that isn't just stop what you're doing and get out. Some people, it might be a little bit more than that. If they're doing high-risk processes, we might want them to shut off something. We want them to close doors and windows to keep that compartmentation we've just talked about. So it's just making sure that we kind of tie it all together. And how to recognise and use firefighting equipment is important, because if the fire does happen, you know, the statistics out there, I think the FIA did a survey last year, and something like 97% of fires that were tackled with a fire extinguisher were done safely and stopped significant damage happening in the premises. So if you do have higher risks, I do really emphasise the fact that we should be doing more training practically on extinguishers. Fire extinguisher training is always an interesting debate. Is it enough to show them a video or show them a few slides? For some areas, it can do something, but for me, I'm a big fan of making sure that we have practical training for certainly the higher risk people. So we're going through a process at the moment of identifying who works in high-risk areas, who is more likely to be exposed to a fire, who's in a risky area. They're going to have more practical training moving forward than maybe somebody who works on a single-storey office. So it's just having a look at that risk-based approach, and we definitely do both. Handling the site-based fire extinguisher is important. So there's no point training them on a type of extinguisher that they're not using. So try and use the ones that you've got on site if you can. And that discussion, live fire training, virtual reality, video-based, I think there's a place for all of it, but it needs assessing to see what's best. We've just gone down the route of training most of our people on VR kit. They have found it so immersive in terms of you're in the room. So you go outside and you do your typical live fire training with an extinguisher. It's not necessarily a real environment. You're outside, there's wind, and you've got loads of space around you. But in the VR world, you're actually up close, and you need to get in and out. And there's smoke going over your head and all that kind of stuff. There's alarms going off. So there's probably a balance for both. And we make sure that they handle the extinguishers and do the VR stuff as well to try and make it a bit more realistic. But again, every organisation does it differently, but just something to bear in mind. Fire wardens and fire marshal training. Training for those with additional responsibilities should be specific to the organisation's procedures, and for me, it should cover the reactive role. If you've got your fire awareness training sorted and into a good level, they don't need to go through all that again on fire warden or fire marshal training. That should be specifically about what their reactive role is for me in a fire, and covering potentially any proactive roles that they've got in regards to, do you want the fire wardens to do monthly checks, weekly checks of things, so covering things like that so that we're training them to do the jobs we're asking them to do. But for me, fire warden and fire marshal training, generic stuff doesn't work for me. I don't really think it's effective, and I think you'd have a hard day in court if you were explaining why you've used a generic fire warden course which doesn't cover your procedures. Now, you can fill the gaps, and obviously that's something that you can bear in mind. So you can do a generic course, but then do a bolt onto that with your own procedures. But then you're double training, so it's one of them things just to keep an eye on. And this one's probably one of the biggest emerging training requirements. So I don't know what your fire brigades do in your particular areas. There is a lot of fire services now that will not turn out to a fire unless it's a specific premises, unless you have confirmed yourself that there is a fire. So you need to put some procedures in place to obviously investigate those fires with your staff that you've got in the early stages. So the big things around this are having a written policy and procedures for people to follow. That is a safe system of work, essentially, to make sure people don't act outside. So what you don't want is a single solo responder going into a room and putting a fire out when they're on their own, for me. You always want like 2 people to investigate a fire alarm if you can. Obviously, there's certain circumstances where you might not have that capability, but making sure you've got some written policies and procedures to keep people safe and risk assessments that go with that. Train the individuals who are undertaking the role. And again, if this is going to be your fire wardens, you can tie this training in with your fire warden training. But if this is in my instance, this is our security team who go and investigate all the fire alarms on site, We're now creating a training course to train them on dynamic risk assessment, because we're essentially sending them towards a fire, potentially. So we need to make sure we've trained them adequately. And then test the process, make sure it works. We found that people were getting a bit lax in a previous job. So making sure that you test rigorously the processes that you've got in place. And what I will guide you towards for that particular element, the FIA, working with Scotland Fire and Rescue, provided a document on investigating fire alarms safely. That is an excellent document to refer back to, and I've used that to create my procedures. It is clearly for Scotland, but it can be applied anywhere. And for me, I have challenged the NFCC, because they should be providing some national guidance on this, because a lot of the brigades are going down this route now of asking us to investigate their fire alarms. So, but ultimately you can use that Scottish guidance, and it is a really good document to refer to. So just in summary, an effective fire safety training programme provides numerous benefits for me. It helps keep people and property safe. It gives people the confidence to do what you're asking them to do. And it really does help and assist with response to a fire emergency on your premises. And the last one helps to demonstrate legal compliance as well.